What if Jon Snow fought Robb Stark? Winter had already started to bite hard in the north, the kind of cold that made even the strongest men question their path. The wind moved to the walls of Winterfell like it carried old memories, whispering names that once meant unity, now torn apart by war and ambition. Jon Snow stood in the courtyard, his hand resting on Longclaw. His breath rose in slow clouds as he stared at the training yard where he once fought side by side with Robb Stark. That felt like another life now. Back then, Robb was his brother in every way that mattered. They trained together, laughed together, and dreamed of battles they thought they would fight as allies. But power changes everything. Titles change everything. Robb Stark was no longer just his brother. He was the king in the north. And Jon Snow, he was still the bastard. The tension between them had been growing for weeks. Small arguments at first, then silence, then cold distance that no fire could fix. Lords whispered in halls. Men chose sides without speaking it out loud. Winterfell, once a home, now felt like a divided fortress holding its breath before a storm. That storm finally came. The day Robb called for judgment. The courtyard filled with warriors of the north. Stark banners moved in the wind like uneasy ghosts. Robb stood on the raised stone steps, wearing fur over steel, his crown of the north heavy on his head. His eyes were firm, but there was something broken inside them too, something he refused to show. Jon stood below him, surrounded by silence. "You disobeyed my command," Robb said, his voice echoing across the yard. "You left your post beyond the wall. You risked our position in this war." Jon did not look away. "I saved lives." "That was not your duty," Robb replied sharply. "You swore yourself to the Night's Watch." Jon's jaw tightened. "I swore to protect the realm." "The realm doesn't stop at your borders, Robb." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some men shifted uncomfortably. Others looked hungry for conflict. The Stark name bound them, but now it also split them. Robb stepped down from the stone slowly, each step heavy like judgment itself. He stopped a few feet from Jon. "You are not just a brother here," Robb said. "You are a threat to discipline, to unity. I cannot allow that." Jon finally understood what this was becoming. Not just punishment, not just politics. Something deeper, something personal that neither of them had fully spoken. "You want to make an example of me," Jon said quietly. "I want to keep the North together," Robb answered. A long silence followed. Snow fell between them, soft and indifferent, as if the world itself refused to choose a side. Then Jon spoke again, voice low. "If you truly believe I am a danger, then say it clearly." Robb's hand tightened around his sword. "You leave me no choice." That was all it took. Steel slid free in a sharp sound that cut through the cold air. Gasps rose from the crowd. Men stepped back. The courtyard that once echoed with training and laughter now felt like a battlefield waiting for its first death. Jon slowly raised Longclaw. Not in anger, but in acceptance. "So be it." Robb's eyes flickered for a moment, just a moment. A memory of them as boys, rolling in the snow, pretending wooden swords were real. That memory died quickly. "Defend yourself," Robb said, and then they moved. The clash of steel rang out like thunder trapped inside stone walls. Jon was fast, trained beyond the wall, fighting with instinct and survival. Robb was controlled, precise, carrying the weight of a king who had learned war too early. Every strike between them felt wrong. Every block carried history. Every step backward or forward was like tearing something that should never have been broken. The men watching did not cheer. No one did. Even the most loyal Stark soldiers felt the weight of what they were seeing. This was not just a fight. It was the North fighting itself. Jon dodged a heavy strike and countered quickly, forcing Robb back. Robb recovered and came again harder, forcing Jon to retreat this time. Snow scattered with every movement, turning the ground into a shifting, unstable field. "Stop this!" Someone shouted from the crowd, but no one stepped forward, because no one could. Not even Jon or Robb wanted to be the one to stop first. Their swords locked for a moment, faces close enough that they could see everything they had lost in each other's eyes. "You don't have to do this," Jon said through clenched teeth. Robb pushed harder. "Yes, I do." And with that, the fight broke apart again, faster, more dangerous, no longer controlled. The North watched as its two strongest wolves tore into each other, and Winterfell held its breath. The clash between Jon Snow and Robb Stark did not feel like a normal fight anymore. It felt like something deeper had cracked open inside Winterfell itself. The courtyard, once a place of training and brotherhood, had turned into a cold arena where history and loyalty were being torn apart with every strike of steel. Snow kept falling, soft and endless, covering the ground in a white blanket that made every step uncertain, every movement heavier than it should have been. Even the sound of their swords seemed different now, less like weapons and more like grief hitting metal. Jon moved first after the break, circling carefully, reading Robb the way he used to in training when they were younger. Back then, Robb had always been slightly more aggressive, more willing to push forward without hesitation, while Jon learned to wait, to adapt, to survive. That difference still existed now, but it was sharper, more dangerous. Robb was no longer just a brother trying to prove himself. He was a king trying to hold a kingdom together with fear and control, and that made every decision he made heavier. Jon could see it in the way Robb held his sword, not just as a fighter, but as someone carrying an entire north on his shoulders. Robb attacked again, faster this time, his blade cutting through the cold air with controlled rage. Jon blocked and stepped back, feeling the impact travel through his arm. He knew Robb wasn't holding back, and that realization hurt more than any wound could. They both knew each other's fighting style too well, too deeply. Every feint, every step, every shift of weight was familiar, like reading a story they had written together years ago. But now the story had turned against itself. Around them, the men of Winterfell stood frozen. No one dared intervene, not because they agreed, but because they understood what this moment meant. If they stopped it too early, the tension would never break. If they let it continue too far, something irreversible would happen. So they watched, torn between loyalty and fear, between the boy they once knew as Robb Stark and the man he had become as king in the north. Jon began to shift his movement. Instead of meeting Robb head-on, he started using angles, forcing Robb to turn, to adjust, to lose his rhythm. He remembered lessons from beyond the wall, where fighting wasn't about honor or tradition, but survival. Robb noticed the change quickly and adjusted too, tightening his defense, refusing to let Jon dictate the pace. Their blades met again and again, each clash sending sparks that disappeared instantly into the snow-filled air. There was a moment, brief but sharp, when Jon almost saw an opening. Robb had overstepped slightly, his balance shifting forward too far. In training, that would have been an easy counter, something Jon could have used to disarm him. But this wasn't training, and Jon hesitated. That hesitation cost him. Robb caught the delay and struck low, forcing Jon to twist awkwardly to avoid the blade. The movement saved him, but it also pushed him back into the edge of the courtyard stones, closer to the walls of Winterfell. Robb stopped for a second, breathing hard, watching him. There was frustration in his eyes now, but also something else. Doubt. It was slipping in, no matter how much he tried to bury it under duty and command. Jon saw it too, and for a moment neither of them moved. The wind filled the silence between them, carrying the weight of everything they were not saying. It would have been easy, in that moment, for either of them to step back, to end it. But pride and pressure had already gone too far. Jon lowered his blade slightly, not in surrender, but in warning. "This isn't what Father would have wanted," he said, voice steady but low. That name hit harder than any sword strike. Robb's jaw tightened instantly. The mention of Ned Stark brought something painful to the surface, something neither of them could fully control. For Robb, it was expectation. For Jon, it was belonging. For both, it was loss. Robb's voice came out colder than before. "Don't speak of him like you know better." "I don't need to know better," Jon replied. "I just know he would never want this." That was enough to break whatever restraint Robb had left. He surged forward again, but this time it was less controlled. The king in him was slipping, replaced by something more human, more raw. Their swords collided again, harder than before, the sound echoing across the courtyard and into the walls of Winterfell like a warning no one could ignore. Jon was forced to give ground quickly, retreating step by step as Robb pushed him toward the center again. The snow beneath them was now marked with deep footprints and scattered lines where steel had scraped stone. Jon's breathing was heavier now, not from exhaustion alone, but from the realization that this fight was becoming less about skill and more about will. Robb was trying to break him, not just defeat him, but Jon refused to break. He steadied himself, shifting his grip on Longcore, and when Robb came in again, Jon met him with full force instead of retreating. The impact of their blades this time was different, stronger, more grounded. Neither gave an inch. Their swords locked again, trembling under equal pressure. Their faces were close, both straining, both refusing to yield. Robb spoke through clenched teeth. "You think I wanted this?" Jon's answer was immediate. "Then stop it." For a second, everything paused again. Just a breath of silence in the middle of violence. Robb's grip loosened slightly, just enough for Jon to feel it. That moment could have ended everything. It could have been the turning point where the fight stopped and something else began. But the North was watching. And kings do not hesitate in front of their men. Robb pushed forward again, breaking the lock, forcing Jon backward once more. The fight continued, but something had changed. It was no longer just skill against skill. It was now pride against regret, duty against blood, and neither side was winning. The courtyard of Winterfell had become a place where two brothers were slowly destroying what remained of their shared past. And still, neither of them fell. The fight between Jon Snow and Robb Stark had reached a point where neither of them was truly fighting for victory anymore. It had become something heavier, something that sat on their shoulders like the weight of the North itself. Every movement felt slower now, not because they were losing strength, but because every strike carried meaning they could no longer ignore. The courtyard around them had fallen into a deep, uneasy silence, broken only by the sound of steel meeting steel and the crunch of snow under shifting feet. Even the wind seemed quieter, as if Winterfell itself was watching carefully, unsure which of its sons it should mourn first. Jon circled again, breathing controlled but heavier than before. His arms were beginning to feel the strain of the constant pressure, but it was not exhaustion that worried him. It was Robb's determination. Robb was not slowing down. If anything, he was becoming more focused, more precise, like a man who had decided that hesitation was no longer an option. Jon could see it in his eyes now. This was no longer about discipline or punishment. It was about ending something that had been building for too long between them, something neither of them had been able to fix with words. Robb moved first again, closing distance quickly. His blade came in low, forcing Jon to step aside sharply. Snow scattered as Jon twisted, his boots slipping slightly on the frozen ground. He recovered quickly, but Robb was already pressing forward, not allowing even a moment for breath. Their swords met again with a sharp crack, both of them pushing against each other with equal force. Jon felt the impact travel up his arm, but he held firm, refusing to give ground. For a brief moment their strength matched perfectly, like two sides of the same soul refusing to yield. Around them, the tension in the courtyard had turned almost unbearable. The men watching were no longer just witnessing a duel. They were watching the collapse of something sacred. Some of them had known Jon since he first arrived at Winterfell as a quiet, uncertain boy. Others had followed Robb into war, calling him king in the North with pride. Now they stood between both loyalties, unsure which version of their world was real anymore. No one spoke. Even whispers felt dangerous. Jon pushed Robb's blade aside and countered quickly, forcing Robb to step back for the first time in a while. It was a small victory, but it shifted the rhythm of the fight. Jon used the moment to reposition himself, regaining control of his breathing and stance. Robb watched him carefully, adjusting as well, both of them learning and adapting in real time, as they had done countless times as boys. But those days of practice had been harmless, playfully. Now every adjustment felt like survival. Robb suddenly stopped advancing. He lowered his sword slightly, just enough to break the flow of combat. Jon didn't attack immediately. He waited, watching him closely, sensing that something had changed in Robb's expression. The anger was still there, but it was buried under something else now, something deeper. Conflict. Robb looked at him like he was trying to decide whether he was fighting an enemy or losing a brother. "You always had to do things your own way," Robb said finally, voice rough but quieter than before. "Even when I gave you a place beside me." Jon tightened his grip slightly, but his voice stayed calm. "I never wanted your place. I never asked for a crown or a war. I just did what I thought was right." Robb let out a short, bitter breath. Right for who? That question hung in the air between them. Jon had no quick answer, because the truth was complicated. What was right beyond the wall was not always what was right in the North. What saved lives in one place could threaten order in another. And standing there facing his brother, Jon realized that Robb was not just fighting him. He was fighting the idea that leadership required sacrifice that even family could not soften. Jon lowered his blade slightly, not in surrender, but in honesty, for people who had no one else. Robb's expression tightened again, but there was hesitation now just beneath the surface. For a moment, it looked like he might stop, like the fight might finally end before it went any further. The men watching leaned forward slightly, sensing that change. Even the air felt different, like the storm inside the courtyard was about to break in a different direction. But then something shifted outside the circle of fighters. A voice called out from the edge of the courtyard, urgent and sharp, breaking the fragile balance they had almost reached. One of the northern scouts stepped forward quickly, breath visible in the cold air, his face tense with news that clearly could not wait. The interruption pulled everyone's attention for just a moment. And in that moment, the fragile stillness between Jon and Robb shattered. Robb turned his head slightly, distracted for only a fraction of a second. It was not enough to fully lose awareness, but it was enough for instinct to take over. Jon saw the opening without thinking. His body moved before his mind fully caught up, years of survival beyond the wall taking control. He stepped forward and brought his blade up in a controlled strike, not aimed to kill, but to disarm, to end the fight before it could spiral further. But Robb reacted at the same time. Steel met steel again, harder than before, and the force of the clash sent both of them stumbling apart. The moment of distraction had changed everything. The balance that had almost formed between them was gone again, replaced by raw tension and renewed instability. Robb's eyes sharpened immediately, realizing what had almost happened. Jon realized it too, and for a brief second, they both stood still, breathing heavily, understanding how close everything had come to collapsing in a single mistake. The scout's voice finally reached them clearly through the tension. Something was happening beyond Winterfell, something serious enough to interrupt a duel between a king and his brother. But neither Jon nor Robb moved immediately. They were still trapped in the moment, still caught between duty and emotion, between stopping and finishing what had already gone too far. Robb slowly raised his sword again, but this time it was different. There was no anger in the movement now, only decision, finality. Whatever hesitation had been left inside him was gone. Jon saw it and understood immediately that the fight was not over yet, and whatever came next would change everything between them forever. The courtyard of Winterfell felt different now, like the air itself had turned heavier after the scout's interruption. Even though the warning from beyond the walls had reached them, neither Jon Snow nor Robb Stark moved away from their positions. The world outside could be burning, but inside that frozen circle of snow and steel, something personal was still unfinished. The moment that had almost softened between them was gone again, replaced by a sharper silence, the kind that comes right before something breaks completely. The men watching no longer knew whether to focus on the message or the fight, because both felt equally dangerous now. Jon stood steady, Longclaw angled slightly downward, his chest rising and falling in controlled breaths. He could still feel the echo of their last clash in his arms. It wasn't pain exactly, but the reminder that every strike from Robb carried history behind it. Robb was not just a skilled opponent. He was someone who knew Jon's rhythm, his hesitation, his instincts, and even the parts of him that he tried to hide. That made this harder than any battle Jon had ever fought beyond the wall, because here, nothing was unknown. Everything was familiar, and that familiarity hurt more than surprise ever could. Robb's stance had changed again. The earlier hesitation was gone, replaced by something colder and more final. Whatever had been human between them a moment ago was now buried under the weight of his crown. Jon could see it clearly now, not just in his eyes, but in the way he carried himself. Robb wasn't just fighting a brother anymore. He was making a decision about the North, about authority, about what kind of king he had to become in order to survive the world collapsing around him. That realization made Jon's grip tighten slightly, not out of anger but understanding. The scout repeated himself more urgently from the side, but his words felt distant now, almost irrelevant compared to the tension in the courtyard. Something important was happening beyond Winterfell, something that likely demanded Robb's attention immediately. Yet Robb did not turn away. That alone told Jon everything. Whatever was happening outside, Robb had already decided that this moment inside these walls mattered just as much, if not more. The North could wait. This could not. Robb stepped forward slowly, each movement controlled, deliberate and heavier than before. Snow cracked under his boots as he closed the distance again. There was no rush now, no wild aggression. This was different. This was certainty. Jon could feel it before the blade even moved. When Robb finally struck, it was not with frustration or anger, but with precision shaped by purpose. Jon barely managed to raise his sword in time to meet it, and the impact rang through the courtyard like a final warning. They pushed against each other again, blades locked, neither giving space. But this time, the energy between them was different. It was no longer a back-and-forth exchange of skill and instinct. It was pressure building toward an ending. Jon could feel Robb leaning into it, not trying to win a duel anymore, but trying to force a conclusion. Every second they stayed locked like that felt like the last second before something irreversible would happen. Jon spoke through the strain, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to do this like this." Robb's eyes didn't leave his. "I already do." There was no hesitation in the words. No anger either, just acceptance of a path already chosen. Jon realized then that Robb wasn't fighting to prove superiority anymore. He was fighting to eliminate uncertainty. As long as Jon stood against his command, as long as he represented something uncontrollable inside Winterfell, Robb would never feel the North was stable. That thought hit Jon harder than any blade. With a sudden shift, Robb pushed him back again, breaking the lock and forcing Jon to stumble a step. The movement wasn't reckless. It was controlled pressure, designed to corner rather than overpower. Jon adjusted quickly, circling again, but the space between them felt smaller now, tighter, like the courtyard itself was shrinking. The watching men remained silent, but their silence was no longer neutral. It was heavy with expectation, like everyone was waiting for something final to happen, so they could finally breathe again. Jon steadied himself and tried something different. Instead of meeting Robb head-on, or circling defensively, he stepped slightly forward, closing distance in a way that broke Robb's rhythm. It worked for a moment. Robb adjusted quickly, but that small disruption created just enough imbalance for Jon to see an opening. Not for attack, but for something else. Communication. Something words had failed to hold earlier. "Robb," Jon said quietly, almost lost in the wind. "This isn't what leadership means. Not like this." Robb didn't respond immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly, but his blade remained ready. Jon continued anyway, knowing he might not get another chance. A king doesn't survive by cutting away every disagreement. He survives by holding it together. That line landed differently. Robb's expression flickered for just a moment, something almost like doubt returning to the surface. But it was brief. Too brief. He had already buried too much inside himself to let it surface fully again. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, almost quieter, but sharper in meaning. "And if what holds it together is a threat inside the walls?" Jon didn't answer immediately, because that was the real divide between them now. Robb saw instability as something to remove. Jon saw it as something to understand. Neither was fully wrong. Neither was fully wrong. Neither was fully right. That was the tragedy of it. Robb moved again, and this time the strike came faster than before. Jon reacted instantly, barely managing to block it, the force pushing him back several steps. Snow scattered under his boots as he slid slightly, regaining balance just before reaching the edge of the courtyard again. The distance between them had stretched, but only for a moment. Robb didn't pause this time. He advanced immediately, keeping pressure constant, not allowing space for thought or reflection. Jon realized then that Robb was no longer testing him. He was finishing this. Not necessarily with death in mind, but with resolution. One way or another, this conflict had to end for Robb to move forward. That made every second more dangerous because desperation had replaced hesitation. Jon adjusted his stance again. Longclaw now held more firmly, his movements calmer but sharper. He stopped retreating and met Robb's next advance directly. Steel clashed again, louder this time, echoing through Winterfell like a final bell that hadn't yet decided whether it was marking an end or a beginning. For a moment, neither of them moved after the impact. They stood locked in place, blades pressed together, breathing hard, faces close enough that everything unspoken between them felt unavoidable. The world outside the courtyard, the scouts' warning, the watching men, even the snow itself, all seemed to fade into background noise. Only the two of them remained, brothers, wolves of the north, standing on the edge of something neither of them could fully step back from anymore. The pressure between Jon Snow and Robb Stark did not break after that last clash. Instead, it settled into something deeper, something more suffocating, like both of them had reached a point where neither victory nor retreat felt possible anymore. The courtyard around them seemed even quieter now, as if Winterfell itself had withdrawn its voice, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the faint hiss of falling snow. Whatever was happening beyond the walls had faded completely into the background of their minds. In that moment there was no North, no war, no crown, no Night's Watch. Only two brothers standing across from each other with steel and history between them. Jon could feel the shift in Robb's posture even before he moved again. It wasn't aggression anymore, it was finality. The kind that comes when a person has already accepted the emotional cost of what they are about to do. Jon had seen that same look in men beyond the wall who knew they would not be returning from a fight. It wasn't rage that made it dangerous. It was acceptance. Robb had crossed into that space where hesitation no longer existed, and that made him more dangerous than he had been at any point in the fight. Robb stepped forward slowly, and Jon did not retreat this time. The space between them closed again, but differently now. There was no circling, no testing. It felt like both of them were being drawn toward the center of something inevitable. When their swords met again, it was not a clash meant to push or break. The sound was sharper than before, cutting through the cold air with a finality that made several of the watching men shift uncomfortably. Even they could feel it now. This was no longer a duel with an uncertain outcome. It was becoming something else entirely. Jon pushed back against Robb's blade, feeling the strength behind it, but also the precision. Robb was no longer wasting movement. Every strike had purpose. Every step was calculated, as if he had already decided how this would end, and was simply moving toward that conclusion. Jon adapted quickly, but even he could feel the difference. Robb was not reacting anymore. He was controlling the space between them in a way that forced Jon into smaller and smaller responses. For a brief moment, Jon tried to break that rhythm again by shifting to the side, using the training he had learned beyond the wall to disrupt Robb's forward pressure. It worked only partially. Robb adjusted instantly, not falling for the same disruption twice. That was when Jon understood something important. Robb had stopped fighting like a brother or even like a rival. He was fighting like a king who had learned from war, from loss, from betrayal, and from everything that had forced him to grow too quickly. And that version of Robb was far harder to read than the boy Jon remembered. They separated slightly again, creating a small gap between them, both breathing heavier now. Jon could see the strain in Robb's face, not just physical but emotional. There was something buried under his control, something that had been held back for too long. Jon had always known Robb carried responsibility heavily, but now it felt like that weight had hardened into something unbreakable, something that would not allow compromise anymore. Jon spoke again, his voice steady but lower, cutting through the silence between them. "This won't fix anything." Robb's eyes stayed locked on him, unblinking. "It already has to." Jon frowned slightly, not understanding at first, but then realizing what Robb meant. In Robb's mind, this fight was not about personal conflict anymore. It was about removing uncertainty from leadership. As long as Jon stood as a figure of resistance inside Winterfell, as long as there was doubt about loyalty or authority, the North would remain divided in Robb's eyes. And Robb could not afford division, not in war, not in survival, not anymore. That realization changed something in Jon's expression. He lowered his blade slightly, not as surrender, but as understanding. "So this is what it takes now, removing anything that disagrees with you?" Robb's jaw tightened. "It's what it takes to keep people alive." There was a pause after that, heavy and uncomfortable, because neither of them could fully dismiss the other's logic. Jon understood survival. He had lived it beyond the wall. Robb understood leadership under pressure, something Jon had never fully carried in the same way. That was why this clash felt so impossible to resolve. They were both right in their own way, and both wrong in ways that could not be ignored. Robb moved first again, but slower this time, more deliberate. Jon met him and their blades collided again, but the force behind it felt different. Less explosive, more controlled. Like both of them were aware that every strike now brought them closer to an ending neither of them could fully control. The courtyard echoed with steel again, but the sound felt heavier, almost mournful now. Even the watching men seemed less like witnesses and more like mourners waiting for a name to be spoken. Jon managed to push Robb back slightly this time, but Robb recovered quickly, stepping into the motion instead of resisting it. That adjustment made Jon realize something else. Robb was no longer trying to overpower him. He was trying to reach a conclusion that could be justified, something that would make sense to those watching. Not just a victory, but a statement that made every movement more dangerous because it meant Robb was thinking beyond the duel itself. Jon felt his arms beginning to tire more noticeably now, but he refused to show it. He had fought worse conditions, worse enemies, worse odds. But this was different. This wasn't survival against strangers. This was survival against someone who knew exactly how he thought, how he moved, how he reacted. There was no hiding inside this fight. Every weakness was shared history. Robb suddenly shifted his grip slightly, changing the angle of his next strike. It came faster than expected, forcing Jon to react late, his blade barely catching it in time. The impact sent a jolt through his shoulder, and for the first time, Jon was forced a full step back without immediate recovery. That single moment changed the rhythm again. Robb pressed forward instantly, sensing the opening, forcing Jon into defense again. The crowd behind them shifted uneasily, sensing the escalation. No one spoke. Even the scout who had brought news stood silent now, realizing that whatever he had come to report no longer mattered in the face of what was happening in front of him. The north beyond the walls could wait. This could not. Jon steadied himself again, breathing slower, forcing his mind back into clarity. He could not match Robb in pure pressure anymore. He had to change something, not to win, but to stop this from becoming irreversible. And as Robb raised his sword once more, Jon realized that the next exchange would decide far more than just the outcome of a fight between two brothers. The next moment did not arrive with hesitation. It came with a kind of silence that only exists right before something irreversible happens. Jon Snow could feel it in the air, in the way Robb Stark held his sword now, in the way the men around them barely even breathed. The courtyard of Winterfell was no longer just a place of stone and snow. It had become a line between two futures, and neither brother was willing to step away from it. Jon adjusted his stance slightly, feeling the weight of Longclaw more clearly now. His arms were tired, but his mind was sharper than before. That was always how it went in long fights. Fatigue stripped away hesitation, leaving only truth. And the truth here was simple in a way neither of them wanted to admit. Robb was not going to stop until something inside him was satisfied. Not victory, not dominance. Something deeper, something tied to responsibility, fear, and the burden of being a king who could not afford uncertainty. Jon understood that more than he wanted to. He had seen leadership break men in different ways beyond the wall, but he had never seen it do this to someone he once called brother. Robb moved again, but slower this time, almost controlled to the point of precision that felt unnatural. Each step was measured, each breath deliberate. Jon met him halfway, and their swords collided again, but this time the impact felt different. There was less force, more intention. It was as if both of them had reached a stage where brute strength no longer mattered, and what remained was decision-making under pressure that neither of them fully wanted to make. Snow continued to fall around them, melting slightly when it hit the heat of their movement, before freezing again on the ground. The courtyard had become uneven, slippery in places, forcing both fighters to adjust constantly. Even small shifts of weight now carried risk. Jon noticed Robb favoring certain angles, subtly steering him toward the center again, away from the edges of the courtyard. It wasn't random. Robb was controlling the space. He was shaping the fight the way he shaped command on a battlefield. That realization made Jon's expression tighten slightly. This was no longer just skill. It was strategy layered over emotion. Jon pushed back suddenly, trying to disrupt that control again, forcing Robb to reset his position. It worked, briefly. Robb was forced to adjust, stepping back half a pace, and for a moment the rhythm broke. Jon used that moment to breathe properly, recalibrating his stance. But Robb recovered quickly, and when he advanced again, there was something sharper in his eyes. Not anger, not frustration, focus. The kind that comes when someone stops reacting and starts deciding. "You keep trying to avoid what this is," Robb said quietly as they circled again, his voice steady despite the strain. Jon didn't answer immediately. He knew words were dangerous now. Every sentence between them carried weight that could tilt everything. But silence was not enough anymore either. So he finally spoke, voice low but controlled. "And you keep trying to turn it into something it doesn't have to be." Robb's grip tightened slightly. "It already is." That was the core of it. Not disagreement over facts, disagreement over meaning. John saw this as conflict that could still be contained, understood, redirected. Robb saw it as something already beyond that point, something that had already crossed the line where containment was possible. That difference was why they were still standing here, blade against blade, instead of walking away. Robb struck again, faster now, breaking the brief pause. John blocked and immediately countered, but Robb met it without difficulty. Their movements became faster again, the temporary calm dissolving back into controlled violence. Steel rang out repeatedly, echoing through Winterfell like distant thunder trapped inside stone walls. The watching men shifted again, tension rising with every exchange. No one spoke. Even breathing felt like a decision now. John felt the rhythm changing again, but this time it wasn't Robb controlling it entirely. It was both of them pushing towards something neither wanted to name. Every strike carried more intent than before. Every block felt heavier. It was as if the fight itself was collapsing inward, compressing toward a single point. Then, in a sudden shift, Robb stepped in closer than before, forcing a tight exchange. Their blades locked again, but this time they were closer, faces nearly within reach. John could see the strain in Robb's eyes more clearly now. Not physical strain, emotional exhaustion, the kind that builds when someone has been carrying too much for too long without release. Robb's voice came low through the tension between their blades. "You think I don't remember who you are?" he said. John held the pressure steady, his breathing controlled. "Then stop fighting me like I'm someone else." Robb's expression tightened, and for a moment something almost like pain flickered across his face. But it disappeared quickly, replaced by resolve. "I'm not fighting you," he said quietly. "I'm fighting what you leave behind when you act without thinking about consequences." That line hit differently, because John knew it wasn't entirely wrong. He had always acted on instinct, on survival, on immediate necessity. Robb, on the other hand, had been forced into thinking about consequences constantly, about how every decision affected thousands. That difference between them had always existed, but now it had become a fracture. John pushed him back slightly, breaking the lock again, creating space. Both of them stepped away for a moment, circling once more, breathing heavier now. The courtyard felt tighter, smaller, as if the walls of Winterfell were slowly closing in to witness the end of something that had once been whole. From the edge, the scout shifted again, looking more urgent, but still no one moved to interrupt. Whatever he carried mattered less now than the fight itself. Even he seemed to understand that. John raised his blade again, but this time slower. He wasn't just preparing to defend or attack, he was searching for something else in Robb's movement. A break, a hesitation, something that could end this without destruction. But Robb didn't give him that chance. He stepped forward once more, and this time there was no uncertainty in his motion at all. It was clean, direct, final in intention. John reacted instantly, but even as their swords met again, he could feel that something had changed permanently. This was no longer a fight that could return to balance. It was now moving toward an ending. Neither of them could fully choose anymore. The clash did not slow down after that last exchange. Instead, it deepened into something more dangerous, like both Jon Snow and Robb Stark had finally stopped holding back even the smallest fraction of themselves. The courtyard of Winterfell, once wide and open, now felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were leaning inward to witness what the North never wanted to see. Snow kept falling steadily, but it no longer felt soft or peaceful. It felt like silence turning into weight, pressing down on every breath, every movement, every thought. John could feel the difference in Robb now more clearly than ever before. It wasn't just skill or strength driving him anymore. It was commitment to an outcome he had already accepted in his mind. That made every movement sharper, cleaner, and far more dangerous. There was no hesitation left in Robb Stark, no internal conflict showing in his stance. He had reached the point where emotion had already been processed and buried, leaving only action behind. Jon had seen that kind of mindset before, in men who had decided that survival required removing anything that complicated decisions. But seeing it in Robb was something else entirely. Jon adjusted his footing again, careful now, aware that the ground beneath them had turned uneven and slick from constant movement. Every step mattered. Every shift in weight could become an opening. He raised Longpaw slightly, not in aggression but in readiness, reading Robb's movements more than reacting to them. That was the only way to survive this stage of the fight now. Reaction alone was no longer enough. Anticipation had become the only defense. Robb stepped forward again, but this time there was no build-up or circling. He closed distance directly, forcing Jon into immediate defense. Their swords met with a sharp, ringing impact that echoed across the courtyard and lingered longer than before, as if even the sound was reluctant to disappear. Jon felt the force travel up his arm, but he held firm, refusing to give ground. Robb pressed harder, trying to break that resistance, but Jon shifted slightly and redirected the pressure instead of absorbing it fully. That small adjustment kept him balanced, but just barely. Around them, the watchers had stopped shifting. They were completely still now, as if movement itself might disturb something already too fragile to touch. The scout's presence at the edge of the courtyard felt distant now, almost irrelevant. Even urgency had lost meaning here. What was happening between Jon and Robb had become its own kind of event, something that no longer belonged to normal time or normal decision-making. Jon managed to push Robb's blade aside and counter with a controlled strike, forcing Robb to pivot and adjust his stance. For a brief second, Jon saw an opening, not in Robb's defense, but in his rhythm, a slight overcommitment in his forward motion. In any other fight, it would have been enough to end things quickly. But Jon hesitated again, not from fear, but from recognition, because he understood what that moment meant. It wasn't just an opportunity to win, it was an opportunity to change everything permanently. Robb saw the hesitation instantly. He always did. That was the problem with fighting someone who knew you too well. Every pause became visible. Every doubt became readable. Robb used that fraction of time to recover and step back into balance, but instead of immediately attacking again, he stopped, just for a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, something shifted between them again. They were no longer just exchanging blows. They were reading each other at a level deeper than words, deeper than intent. Jon could see exhaustion in Robb's eyes now, but not physical exhaustion alone. It was something closer to emotional depletion, like carrying too many decisions for too long without relief. Robb was still standing because he had decided to, not because he had endless strength left. That realization softened something in Jon's expression, even as he kept his blade raised. "You're pushing this too far," Jon said quietly, his voice cutting through the wind. Robb didn't respond immediately. His breathing was heavier now, but still controlled. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with anger, but something more restrained. "I'm ending what should have been ended earlier." Jon shook his head slightly. "This doesn't end anything. It just breaks what's left." That line hung between them longer than any strike had. For a moment, Robb didn't move, not because he agreed, but because something in him was reacting to it, despite everything he had buried. Jon saw it, just a flicker, a crack in the surface, but it was enough to remind him that Robb was still there underneath everything else. Still his brother, not just a king. But the North was watching, and that was the weight Robb could never fully escape. He stepped forward again, breaking the moment deliberately this time, refusing to let it settle into something softer. The next exchange was faster than before, sharper, more compressed. Steel met steel repeatedly in rapid succession, each impact smaller but more frequent, like pressure building without release. Jon matched him as best he could, but even he could feel the difference now. Robb wasn't just fighting him. He was forcing space to collapse between them. Their blades locked again, this time closer than before, their faces nearly within breath of each other. Jon could see every detail now, the strain in Robb's jaw, the controlled tightness in his eyes, the way he refused to let anything slip through his expression. But beneath it all, there was something Jon could not ignore anymore. Not hatred, not anger, determination shaped by fear of what happens if control is lost. "You don't trust me," Jon said quietly. Not as accusation, but realization. Robb's answer came instantly, low and firm. "I can't afford to." That was it. The core truth neither of them could move past. Trust required safety. Safety required stability. And Robb no longer believed stability could exist while uncertainty remained inside Winterfell's walls. Jon represented that uncertainty, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented in the minds of others. Jon pushed back again, breaking the lock, forcing distance between them. Both of them reset quickly, circling once more but slower now. There was less energy in the movement, not because they were weakening, but because the fight had reached a stage where every action carried more consequence than before. Even small movements felt significant now. The wind shifted slightly across the courtyard, carrying cold air through the space between them. Snow continued to fall, but the ground beneath their feet was now uneven, marked with repeated steps, cuts, and pressure points where they had fought too intensely. Winterfell had become a map of their conflict. Robb lifted his sword again, but this time paused before advancing. Just a fraction of hesitation returned, not enough to change his intent, but enough for Jon to see that the human part of him had not completely disappeared. And in that brief pause, both brothers understood the same thing, without saying it aloud. Whatever happened next would not just decide the fight, it would decide what remained of them afterward. The pause between Jon Snow and Robb Stark did not last long, but it felt heavier than anything that had come before it. In that small stretch of silence, the entire courtyard of Winterfell seemed to hold its breath, as if even the stone beneath them understood that something irreversible was building. Snow drifted slowly between them, untouched for a moment before melting on the heat of their presence, then freezing again as it hit the ground. The world outside those walls still existed, still demanded attention, but inside this space it had been reduced to something distant and unimportant. Jon stood steady, his blade raised but not rushing forward. He could feel the shift in Robb again, subtle but undeniable. The hesitation was not fully gone anymore. It had returned in fragments, like cracks forming in something that had been sealed too tightly. That was always how it worked, with decisions made under pressure. Even the strongest resolve carried fractures if held long enough. Jon had seen it in commanders beyond the wall, men who convinced themselves they were acting for survival until something inside them finally started to question the cost. Robb was not immune to that. No one was. But Robb was still moving forward, slowly, deliberately, as if each step had already been measured in his mind before it touched the ground. Jon recognized that rhythm now. It was not hesitation, it was control. Robb was forcing himself to remain composed, refusing to let emotions slip back into action. That made him even more dangerous in a different way, because it meant every movement was now intentional rather than reactive. Jon adjusted his stance slightly, knowing that the next exchange would not be like the last ones. They had already passed the stage of testing. This was now about conclusion. Robb closed the distance again, and the sound of steel returned immediately as their swords met. The impact was firm, controlled, and sustained for a moment longer than before. Neither pushed too quickly. Instead, they held pressure against each other, reading the resistance, adjusting in small increments. It no longer looked like a chaotic duel. It looked like two forces trying to define the shape of an ending without fully committing to how that ending should look. Jon shifted his grip subtly, redirecting Robb's pressure rather than resisting it directly. It allowed him to create a slight angle, enough to slip out of the direct lock and force Robb to adjust. Robb did so immediately, stepping into a new position without breaking rhythm. That adaptability showed how far he had come from the younger version of himself, Jon remembered. Robb was no longer just reacting to threats. He was shaping them. Around them, the men of Winterfell remained frozen in place. The earlier tension had now turned into something closer to dread. They were no longer watching a duel for dominance. They were witnessing a conflict that had lost any clear sense of victory. Even the scout at the edge of the courtyard no longer looked impatient. He looked uncertain, as if he had forgotten what urgency meant in the face of what was unfolding. Jon broke away from the lock first, stepping back to reset distance. Robb did not immediately pursue. Instead, he watched him carefully, recalibrating again. That brief stillness between them felt like a conversation neither of them wanted to speak aloud. Jon could feel it building in Robb now, something beneath the surface of discipline. Not rage, not even anger anymore. Something closer to inevitability. As if Robb had accepted that there would be no clean outcome here, only a necessary one. "You're not thinking like yourself anymore," Jon said quietly, lowering his voice so it carried only between them. Robb's expression tightened slightly, but he did not deny it. Instead, he answered after a brief pause, "I am thinking exactly like myself. That's the problem." That answer lingered longer than expected, because Jon understood what Robb meant. Leadership had changed him. Responsibility had changed him. Every decision now carried consequences, that did not allow the luxury of personal attachment. Jon had always known Robb would be shaped by power, but seeing it now fully formed in front of him made it harder to recognize the brother he had grown up beside. Jon raised his blade again, but more slowly this time, not in preparation for attack, but in acknowledgement that the fight had reached its final phase. Robb saw it too. There was no need for further escalation, no need for testing or probing. Everything that could be understood between them had already been revealed through movement, through resistance, through refusal to yield. Robb stepped forward again, and this time there was no hesitation at all. The strike came clean and direct, forcing Jon to meet it immediately. The impact echoed louder than before, sharper, almost final in tone. They moved together again, but now every exchange carried a sense of compression, like space itself was shrinking around them. Jon could feel the rhythm accelerating even as fatigue settled deeper into his muscle. He managed to deflect one strike and counter with a controlled motion that forced Robb to adjust his footing. For a moment, Jon saw an opening again, but this time he did not hesitate. Instead, he redirected it into positioning rather than attack, choosing control over conclusion. That decision mattered more than either of them fully realized in that instant, because it shifted the nature of the fight slightly away from destruction and toward restraint. Robb noticed it immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in frustration but recognition. Jon was not trying to win in the traditional sense anymore. He was trying to stop it from becoming something permanent. That realization created a brief pause in Robb's rhythm, a fraction of reconsideration that broke the flow just enough for Jon to breathe more fully again. But Robb recovered quickly, faster than before. He stepped back in, closing distance again, forcing Jon to defend once more. Steel met steel repeatedly in controlled bursts, each exchange tighter than the last. The courtyard had become almost unrecognizable now as a space of combat. It was no longer wide or open. It felt concentrated, like every movement was being pulled toward a center neither of them could step away from. Jon could feel his strength beginning to plateau, not collapsing, but reaching its limit of sustain. He knew Robb was in the same state, even if it did not show as clearly. That was what made this stage so dangerous. When both sides reached equal exhaustion but neither accepted the need to stop, mistakes became more likely, and mistakes in this moment would not be minor. Robb raised his blade again, but slower this time, and Jon mirrored him instinctively. For a brief second, they stood in near symmetry, both of them reading the final structure of the fight. There was no more advantage to be gained in speed or strength alone. What remained was decision, and both of them knew it. The wind moved through Winterfell again, carrying snow across the courtyard in a thin sheet, and for the first time since the fight began, neither brother moved immediately. Because whatever came next would not be another exchange, it would be the ending. The silence between Jon Snow and Robb Stark did not feel empty anymore. It felt final, like the world had already decided something and was simply waiting for them to accept it. Snow drifted down between them in slow, quiet motion, covering the marks they had carved into the courtyard, but it could not erase what had already happened. Winterfell stood around them like a witness that would never forget, its walls holding every echo of steel, every breath, every moment where brothers had stopped being brothers. Jon kept his blade raised, but not tightly now. There was no rush left in him, no anger pushing him forward, only awareness. He could see Robb clearly in a way he hadn't earlier in the fight, not as a king, not as an opponent, just as Robb, the boy who once laughed too easily in the snow, the boy who once shared training grounds without thinking about crowns or loyalty or the weight of command. That version of him still existed somewhere under everything else, but it had been buried under decisions that could not be undone. Robb stood opposite him, breathing heavier than before, but still steady. His sword remained in his hand. It no longer felt like it was moving toward attack. It felt like it was waiting, not for opportunity, but for resolution. His eyes stayed locked on Jon, and for the first time in a long while, there was no calculation in them, no strategy, only understanding. He knew what this had become, not a duel for dominance, but a breaking point neither of them could walk away from unchanged. Jon spoke first, quietly, his voice carrying through the cold air without effort. "This doesn't have to be the end between us." Robb did not respond immediately. His grip tightened slightly, not in readiness to strike, but in the weight of everything behind those words. When he finally spoke, it was lower than before, almost strict of command. "It already is. one way or another. Their truth hung between them longer than any weapon could, because neither of them could deny it anymore. The North had already watched too much. Too many men had already chosen silence instead of intervention. Too many decisions had already been made in the space between their movements. Even if they stopped now, something between them would remain broken in a way that could never fully be repaired. Jon lowered his blade slightly, not in surrender but in acceptance of something deeper. He had spent so long fighting beyond the walls, surviving things that should have killed him, learning to adapt to impossible conditions. But this was different. There was no enemy here that could be defeated without consequence. There was only family, and that made every outcome heavier than survival. Robb saw the change in Jon's posture and did not advance. For a moment, neither of them moved at all. The courtyard, once filled with the sound of conflict, was now almost completely still. Even the wind seemed hesitant. The men watching did not speak. No one dared to break what felt like a moment already removed from time. Jon finally exhaled slowly. If this is what it takes to keep the North together, then maybe it was already falling apart. Robb's expression tightened slightly at that, but not with anger. With something closer to exhaustion. It's already falling apart, he admitted quietly. I'm just trying to stop it from collapsing completely. That honesty changed something in the air between them. It removed the illusion that either of them was fighting for anything simple. There was no villain here, no clear right or wrong. Only two people shaped by different responsibilities trying to prevent a future neither of them fully trusted. Jon took one step forward, not aggressively, not defensively, just forward. Robb did not move back. Instead, he watched him carefully, as if trying to understand what that step meant. Jon stopped at a respectful distance, lowering Longclaw fully now, letting the tip rest lightly against the snow-covered ground. I never wanted your crown, Jon said quietly, and I never wanted to take anything from you. Robb's voice came after a pause. But you do, whether you mean to or not. Jon looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since the fight began, there was no tension in his face. Only clarity. Then maybe the problem was never me standing here, he said. Maybe it was everything we were forced to stand for. Robb did not answer immediately. His sword lowered slightly, just enough that it was no longer in a ready position. That small movement changed everything, not because it ended the fight, but because it acknowledged that the fight no longer needed to continue in the same way. The men around them still did not move, but something had shifted in their stillness. The expectation of violence had begun to fade, replaced by uncertainty. Even the scout looked less urgent now, as if whatever message he carried had been pushed into irrelevance by what had just been said. Robb finally spoke again, quieter than ever. If I stop this, they will see weakness. Jon shook his head slightly. If you continue it, they will see fear. That answer struck deeper than either of them expected, because it wasn't an argument. It was recognition of how leadership actually worked. Fear, disguised as strength, always demanded more sacrifice, and weakness, when honest, sometimes built more stability than control ever could. Robb closed his eyes briefly, just for a moment, like something inside him had reached its limit. When he opened them again, the weight was still there, but something had shifted under it. Not resolution, not peace, but decision made differently. He slowly lowered his sword completely, not dropping it, not discarding it, just lowering it until it no longer pointed toward Jon. The courtyard remained silent. Jon did not move for a moment, as if waiting for something to follow. But nothing came. No sudden strike, no continuation, only stillness. Finally, Jon lowered Longclaw fully as well. Snow continued falling between them, covering the marks of their fight, softening the edges of what had nearly become irreversible. Neither of them spoke for a long moment after that. There was no need to. Everything that could be said had already been spoken through movement, resistance, and the refusal to let misunderstanding define them completely. Robb looked at Jon one last time, and there was something in that look that did not fully heal, but also did not break further. Something in between. You should never have had to stand here, Robb said quietly. Jon gave a faint, tired exhale that might have been almost a smile. Neither should you. For the first time since the fight began, Robb did not respond with command or defense. He simply stood there, letting the words exist without resistance. The North remained uncertain. Winterfell remained certain. Winterfell remained silent. But the fight had finally ended.